Music is one of the most genuine expressions of human emotion in existence. It has shaped our culture, our language, and our very understanding of what it means to be human throughout history. There is perhaps no other art form that connects so deeply to the human psyche and emotion as music does. Regardless of the culture, time period, or genre, there seems to be an innate part of us that are drawn to music. Anthropology is the study of humanity in all its forms, and I really can't think of anything that is more human than music. The origin of music is a concept that has been debated by anthropologists for almost 100 years. The earliest forms of ancient music that we know about come from Babylonia in the form of the Hurrian hymns. This has led to speculation about whether the innate connection to music was developed evolutionarily. Charles Darwin famously believed that music was created as a sense of expression of the sexual act, and evolutionarily, this makes some sense. However, psychologist Herbert Spencer had a different view. To Spencer, in a way similar to birds, humans likely evolved music as an emotional response to external stimuli. To him, it represents the overflow of energy in both cases, and ceases under depressing conditions. This definition is accepted by many scholars, and I agree with Spencer, but I do think it goes deeper. However, the question remains, as with all art, what makes music good or bad? Is there even such a thing as bad music? This is an interesting question that anthropologists have argued over for decades. Most agree that art is subjective, but the extent of that is debated. To me, I think we have to go back to Spencer's words. Music, and art in a broader sense, represents the immense contrast between the small combinations of tones constituting a cadence of grief or anger or triumph, and the vast combinations between them. Music is simply a pure expression of human emotion in all of its aspects. Thus, as long as it is truly authentic to the human condition and the emotions of the artists themselves, it can't be considered bad. Over the past century or so, something truly monumental has occurred from a historical and anthropological perspective. Music has transformed completely. The fusion of African rhythms and Western classical music led to the development of jazz in the late 1800s, and then blues and folk music shortly afterwards. According to historians David Hatch and Stephen Millward, the history of the song is thus almost the history of pop music in general, taking in the folk music roots of blues and country music. These distinctly African American music forms eventually permeated the white American culture of the time, largely due to the influence of artists such as Elvis Presley. Presley embraced the rebellious culture of these movements, influenced by the infamous tall tale of Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil and creating rock and roll. His attitude resonated deeply with the youth of the late 1950s, who were raised in a very restrictive environment after the events of World War II. Elvis Presley arguably changed history more than any other musician of his time, perhaps with the exception of one other group. Overseas in England, blues and early rock and roll were becoming extremely popular. Inspired by the popularity of Elvis Presley and other blues legends, 4 young men in Liverpool formed a band. Perhaps you've heard of them. The Beatles were immediately a success, earning a huge following in Liverpool for their easygoing blues sound, and it wasn't long before they were a hit all across the world. While the Beatles were largely influenced by artists such as Elvis, they incorporated simple song structures and catchy melodies in a way that almost no other artist had done before, and many people see them as the inventors of what we now know as pop music. However, this didn't last for long. The Beatles constantly sought to reinvent their sound, pushing the limits of the commonly used song structures that they themselves had helped establish. Incorporating elements of experimental songwriting and psychedelic experiences into their music, they introduced the world to a whole new form of creative expression that had previously been reserved to underground artists and experimental composers. The Beatles created an explosion of new rock genres and artists, with artists such as the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, Michael Jackson, Black Sabbath, Queen, Nirvana, and Radiohead, all transforming the music landscape from the 70s to the 90s. Experimenting with the formulas that the Beatles had established, they created something new. And then, something changed. Corporations had always played a major role in music since the early days of pop music, but there was a distinct cultural shift in the late 1980s that escalated into the present day. Rock and pop music were both massive cultural forces, and it is only natural for corporations to capitalize off of that. When we analyze media, we have to understand that popular culture becomes popular because it gains an audience that perpetuates its success and fame. Author Rebecca Quibel writes of the music industry during this time as a cultural populist democracy that allows the masses to determine the trajectory of their own culture. Music labels and corporations realized this and promoted music that appealed to the masses, rather than focusing on individual talent and creativity. At first, the shift was subtle, but today the effects are everywhere. Massive pop stars that some people have never even heard of, algorithms cycling the same songs over and over and over again, boards of songwriters engineering the next algorithm hit like some nuclear bomb. These things didn't exist in the late 20th century. Now, I'm sure you've heard this a million times before. Music isn't as good as it used to be. It's a natural cycle of life, said by the older generation to the younger generation. But is music really worse today than it was 50 years ago? We need to look at this from an anthropological perspective. Culture is at the heart of every aspect of art in a society, and it's no different with music. The music of Elvis Presley, the Beatles, Pink Floyd, and Michael Jackson were all products of their time, and to be honest, they can't be compared to modern music. However, if one wants to argue for a decline in music as a whole, there has to be a correlating shift in culture that causes it. Historically, this has happened during the Great Depression, for example, when the arts declined significantly from their prevalence in the Roaring '20s as people simply no longer had the money to consume art. However, this issue is a little bit different. The shift comes from more of a stagnation in the artistic and cultural centers of the West. As Queeble writes once again, postmodernism, which should always be remembered as the cultural logic of late capitalism, allows for a culture that the majority of consumers choose. This type of social Darwinism privileges approachable and perceived successful acts of culture. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does have consequences. This creates a sort of feedback loop, especially with the rise of online algorithms, where consumers like what they consume and then receive more of it over and over and over again. But eventually the personality starts to go away in favor of what the masses want. So is music today worse then? No. It's just harder to find. Algorithms can be a great tool for exposure to new music, but many artists who favor individuality and deviate more from the mainstream sound audience are used to in today's culture are suppressed by the algorithms more often than not. However, there is more music than ever being produced daily, and new independent artists are gaining massive popularity in more niche circles online. This has produced an interesting result, as there's really two spheres of success nowadays when it comes to music. I would define these spheres as the popular and the critical. Many of the popular artists right now have been extremely successful in the sense that they have amassed a great number of fans and hit songs, but have not been received well at all critically. Many songs created by these artists are popular with the algorithm for a few weeks, and then they're never heard again. On the other hand, the critical music space has changed drastically as well. Many music fans have turned to online sites to voice their opinion on certain artists and albums, leading to sites such as Rate Your Music and Reddit, as long as YouTubers such as Anthony Fantano become major contributors to the modern music culture. Because of this, the artists who have the most cultural influence fit into both spheres. Modern artists such as Kendrick Lamar, Billie Eilish, and Charli XCX have managed to become cultural figures and artists that both spheres respect, and they will likely continue to influence the music industry in this way. Overall, I think that the future of music is actually very bright, and more artists will continue to make music as the tools to get started become more readily available every single day. As long as new artists manage to stay relevant both commercially and critically, the possibility for upward mobility is perhaps more than it ever has been in the music industry, despite of course the many challenges that we still face. As an independent musician myself, this topic is very personal to me. It's extremely difficult for new artists such as myself to make it big in today's music culture, but this is nothing new. The music industry has always been extremely competitive, but today there are more tools than there ever have been for people to get their ideas into action and find an audience. And I'm sure this will just continue to grow as time goes on. To me, music has been such an important part of my life, and I know that it has been for so many other people throughout history. And I just don't see that going away anytime soon. Music will always be a part of us, whether we like it or not. We just need to do our part and listen to the artists we genuinely enjoy, rather than what is popular by everyone else. Music and culture are so deeply intertwined, and the connection will only become deeper as we progress as a species. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.